Eastern European Studies and faculty advisor to the Jewish Student Organization. Thank you so much for bringing us today part 3, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Gila. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us. A shout out to my friend Howard Dragutsky again, Rabbi Shub. I hope you got you got my email. And Dr. Ritt, good to see you. Say hello to your wife. So, my friends, I left you the last time talking about that fateful German decision at the end of 1916 to go on to unrestricted submarine warfare. We are now in the year, the fateful year, the very consequential year, 1917. Now, let me begin at the beginning here. I want to talk to you about a number of things, and I will go, when I pick a theme, I will take it to the end of 1917 and then come back to another theme that may have begun in the early part of 1917. So let me talk to you about the first important development, a very significant development of 1917, and that is the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. The Romanovs had come to power in 1613. They had celebrated their tricentennial in 1913. They had survived numerous attempts at overthrow, revolutions, again, coups d'etats, assassinations. They thought they were impregnable. But in the space of 72 hours at the end of February in 1917, they will be overthrown. The longest lasting dynasty in Europe would go in, as Trotsky said, to the garbage can of history. How do we explain this? How do you explain the overthrow of this long and lasting and seemingly legitimate dynasty? The answer, of course, is very, very deep. I'll try to spin it out. Finish the discussion on this particular area before Shavuos, but I will move very, very quickly. Russia before World War I was a pressure cooker. It was seething with discontent and revolt. The workers lived in Russia, they lived a terrible existence. Everywhere in Europe, the impact of the Industrial Revolution was being reduced, probably because of universal male suffrage in parts of Europe, the presence of a large and really legal socialist party. And then, of course, governments began to intervene in the struggle between labor and business. Governments began, because of universal suffrage, to intervene on the side of labor. None of this exists in Russia. No legal trade unions, no legal socialist party, no parliament, nobody votes. And so the workers are going to work in Russia. They're going to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in absolutely abominable conditions. They are seething with discontent. And for the peasants, again, are going to suffer greatly. Remember, in the 19th century, for a variety of reasons, there is a population growth of geometric proportions. And the result is going to be a great deal of population increase in Russia and a shortage of land. If you want to think of historical analogies, let me give you one, but we're always with the caveat that historical analogies are always flawed. They're never exact. How much of American history would have been different if each black family had been given 18 acres or 40 acres and a mule? That was one of the proposals during Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln, of course, is going to make sure that that doesn't take place. How much of American history would have been different? Because what's going to happen in the aftermath of this abortive Emancipation Proclamation, what's going to happen is large numbers of black people are going to be thrown out, thrown off their land, and thrown back on the mercies of their former plantation owners. And what's going to happen to them is they will become sharecroppers and tenant farmers, dooming them and their descendants to perpetual poverty, in some cases reaching down into the 21st century. In the case of Russia, there was also an abortive emancipation. The peasants were emancipated in Russia with some land on February 19th of 1861. But it's a bad emancipation. That is, they don't get enough land, the population is increasing, the landlords and the government continue to own most of the land, and that's a recipe eventually for revolution. And the middle class, here's a Berk's law of history. Wherever there's a middle class, there will be a desire for a constitution, a parliament, and suffrage. They get nothing. The Tsarist government will not bend. Finally, as a consequence and as a concession, after the 1905 revolution in Russia, the government agreed to the creation of a Duma, a Russian parliament. But it really was a pseudo-parliament. Most Russians or the parliament did not have real power. And even at the highest levels, there was a great deal of discontent with Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra. The reason being, again, I'm not being condescending or sarcastic here. This is not a man who was the sharpest tool in the shed. Nicholas II was a good husband and a good father. He was a lousy ruler, and he was an anti-Semite to boot. Now, what's going to happen as we come closer to World War I? There are two things that will discredit the dynasty, not only in the eyes of large numbers of Russians, but even into the privileged classes of Russia, even into the aristocracy, many of whom were very conservative. They were monarchists, and they were anti-Semites. But it seemed to many of them that the Tsar was going too far. And now I bring you to, again, the Balas affair. This is a very interesting incident in Russian history. That is, a Jew, in his mid-30s, is accused in 1911 of committing an act of blood libel. A teenage Ukrainian boy is found in a bathtub, body filled with holes. And that's like adding up 1 and 1 and coming up to 2. In relatively primitive Russia, or let's say superstitious Russia, the charge of ritual murder is going to surface. The Jews did it. The Jews did it because that's what the Jews do. That is, they kill Christian boys and girls, so the argument is, and use their blood for the baking of the unleavened bread, the matzah. It's a charge that goes back to medieval England. Thousands upon thousands of Jews will die as a consequence of that charge. That charge now surfaces in Russia. Mendel Balas is accused of committing the act of murder. But he didn't do it. Later on, investigators will find out that the boy was killed by his mother and the mother's lover. They were thieves. And the boy wanted some toys, and he said he would go to the police and inform upon them if he didn't get what he wanted. So the mother and the lover, they kill this teenage Ukrainian boy. So what I'm trying to tell you here is the proverbial is going to hit the fan. This is, again, for a historical analogy, the Balas affair in Russia is to what the Dreyfus affair was in France. Society splits, but for our purposes, what is significant? There are two things that are significant here. One is he gets a fair trial, and in the end, he's acquitted. That is, he didn't do it. But the jury does say, while they acquit him, that this is actually an attack. It is a ritual murder attack, and the Jews did it, but this particular Jew was not involved in it. That's not a good thing, because anti-Semitism is going to spread. It was there already to a large extent. It's going to spread even further. And the other thing is going to be, it tells you a lot about Imperial Russia, that a Jew could still be acquitted. That's the difference between an authoritarian society and a totalitarian society. There is still room to maneuver. There's wiggling room in an authoritarian society. If this had happened in the Soviet Union, there wasn't a chance that a man like Balas could be acquitted. In Nazi Germany, you're whistling Dixie if you think a Jew could be acquitted of anything. It also, as a third consequence of this, is going to be, again, please keep in mind, even well-to-do, privileged Russians are going to come to the conclusion, this Tsar is a fool. We got to get rid of him. And so, again, what I'm trying to convey to you here is Russia was a pressure cooker. And comes the war, a war that Russia should not have entered. We went over this in the first lecture. A war that Russia should not have entered. All of the problems are going to be exacerbated. And remember what Senator Hiram Johnson of California said, opposing the American entry into World War I. He said, and I come back to this all the time, I drum it into my students, in war, the first casualty is the truth. Rumors begin to spread in Russia. Something's wrong. Is the Tsar simply incompetent? Is it because the Tsarina, Alexandra, is a German? Is she speaks Russian with a German accent? Is she informing secretly German generals about Russian military plans? Whatever it may be. By 1916, again, things are getting very heated. A prominent Russian historian who is the leader of the Liberal Party in Russia stands up in the Duma, it says Pavel Milyukov, and raises a number of questions. He gives an answer. He says, we are losing at the front. We have no ammunition. And then he answers his own question. He says, is this stupidity or is it treason? Is it stupidity or it's treason? And so hostile do some people in the privileged classes become towards the Tsarist government that they believe that in order to save the dynasty, they got to get rid of the man who they think is behind all of the bad decisions in Russia. Actually, Rasputin was the one prominent Russian, or close to the Tsar, who said we should not enter the war. But they entered the war. But Rasputin, remember, the devil incarnate. This is a man that will have sexual intercourse with anybody he can find. So what's going to happen here is mid-December 1916, he is invited to the Yusupov Palace. If you ever get to what is now called St. Petersburg, make sure they take you to the Yusupov Palace. He was one of the wealthiest men, connected by blood to the Tsar, but most importantly of all, married to one of the most beautiful women in Russia. And what do? He, that is the prince, and some of his right-wing, really far-right colleagues are going to invite Rasputin to spend an evening, and they dangle before him the possibility of having some relationship with again, the princess, Yusupov's wife. And so what's going to happen, they come, they put enough poison in his drink to probably kill a herd of elephants, but this man is made out of iron. He drinks it, he sings bawdy songs. One of them pulls out a revolver, shoots him a couple of times, he doesn't die. They finally drop him into the Neva River, which courses through Petrograd, and finally he is dead. The significance of this is, again, that the most privileged elements in Russian society are convinced that Russia is going down a bad path, that the Tsar either has to be disengaged from some of his advisors, like Rasputin, or maybe in fact the Tsar should be removed from office. This is the situation at the end of 1916. Late February 1917, food shortages, skyrocketing prices, enormous casualties taking place. Great deal of discontent in Petrograd. And at the end of February, the socialist parties in Russia observe a holiday, which is actually observed in many countries down to this day. We make mention of it in our country, but it is not a legal holiday. That's International Women's Day. That's a day commemorated by socialist parties all over the world. And on that day, at the end of February, the women workers of Petrograd go out on strike. Remember, they're making munitions for the war. The government cannot tolerate this. The Tsar allows local authorities to call out the police to crush the women workers. When the male workers in the factories find out that this is taking place, they pour out into the streets in support of the women. That's an escalation. Now the Tsarist government escalates on its part. It now calls out some military units and the real shock troops of the Tsarist government going back centuries, the Cossacks. Not the Khazars, the Cossacks. These are the elite forces within the Tsarist military, within the Imperial Russian Army. They come out, and for the first time in history, for the first time in Russian history, it had never happened before, Trotsky, in his magnum opus about the Russian revolutions, writes, the term that he uses, the English translation is, the melting process took place. That is, the Cossacks don't shoot on the peasants, don't shoot on the people who are demonstrating. They melt into the crowd and turn their weapons over to the crowd. In 72 hours, the Tsarist government is no more. The Romanov dynasty, which once again had experienced 303 years of living in power, it is now done. And what's going to take place is something very, very interesting, unique in Russian history, and really unique probably in world history up to that period of time. When the Tsar announces that he's going to abdicate, and when the man that he designates as his successor, his uncle, he also abdicates, members of the Duma, that Russian parliament that was still in Petrograd at the time, now declare that they are the legal successor to the Tsarist government. They proclaim what is known as the provisional government, not the provincial, the provisional government with a capital P and a capital G. They now say they are the legal government of Russia following the abdication of the Tsar. This is the government that will be recognized by the United States, Great Britain, and France, and by most of the countries in the world. The problem, however, is that in Petrograd, and later in Moscow, and later in a whole host of Russian cities and towns, there's another government. The workers in all of these places now form their own government. They call it the Soviet. That's the Russian word for a council. And what is going to be created in Petrograd and followed in all many, if not most Russian cities and towns is the Soviet of Petrograd Workers. The Soviet of Petrograd Workers. Soldiers who are stationed in the garrison send a delegation to the Soviet and say, we want to be included. And so what is now soon taking place is the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. Do you understand what I've just told you? There are now two governments. A legal government, officially recognized by a good part of the world, including the Allies, and now an unofficial government that commands the allegiance of more millions of people than does the provisional government. This is what is called in Russian dvoevlastia, that is dual power. And the history of Russia in 1917 is the relationship between the provisional government and the Soviet. Now, there are other things that take place in 1917, and we will get to them. But I want to play this out until the Bolsheviks come to power. Late February, March, early April of 1917. There's not much tension between the provisional government and the Soviet. Not much tension. And then in April of 1917, Vladimir Lenin arrives in Russia at the Finland station in Petrograd. To this day, railroad stations in what is today again called St. Petersburg, the railroad stations are named for the places from which the trains come. And in the old days, when you would visit the Soviet Union, the tour guides would always take you to the Finland station and to the platform where Lenin spoke. When he arrives in April of 1917, Lenin proclaims the April Theses, in which it's a bombshell, an absolute bombshell. Lenin says, all power to the Soviets. He now calls for the Soviet of Petrograd, the Petrograd Soviet of Soldiers and Workers Deputies, of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, to take power. Take power in the name of the working class. He also says to the peasants, the landlords took the land from you, expropriate the expropriators. To the workers, he says, seize the factories. To the national minorities like the Ukrainians and the Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians and Poles, Armenians and Georgians, he says, you want out? Get out. Lenin is going to ride to power in October of 1917 on the anarchistic instincts of the Russian masses. But it's not easy to do that. Some of the army people remain loyal. The provisional government will not cede power. And the most famous leader of the provisional government was a man by the name of Alexander Kerensky, 35 years old in 1917, a prominent attorney and a man of the moderate left. In fact, he earned a reputation by representing revolutionaries who were brought to court by the imperial or by the Tsarist government. He's not a bad guy. He's a good guy. He's what we would call in our country today a good liberal. But he's got a problem, a very, very serious problem. The Germans are coming. And he's got to decide, should he keep Russia in the war or not? Should he agree to the peasant revolution that has already taken place? That is, what the Russian Revolution, what the peasants have done after February 1917 is to begin a revolution, an agrarian revolution, seizing the landlord's lands. And the workers are beginning to seize the factories. And the national minorities are beginning to talk about pulling out of imperial Russia. Can he allow that? In retrospect, we know what he should have done is to pull Russia out of the war. That's what he should have done. And then engage in the reform. Give the people what they want. But you got to be fair. Here, the chronology is important. Timing is important. As Kerensky looks at the world, he reasons, if I pull Russia out of the war, the Germans will take their forces from the Eastern Front, ship them to the Western Front, and defeat the British and French armies before the Americans get there. The Germans will win the war. And then once having won the war, they will again shift their forces back from the Western Front, which they have conquered, send them to the Eastern Front, and deal a dismembering, a knockout blow against Russia, and Russia will not survive. Kerensky is postponing reform because he wants to continue the war for the reasons that I've given you. That is a catastrophe for him, for the provisional government, and Russia. Because the closer we come through the summer into the early autumn of 1917, anti-war fever is just blossoming in Russia. And again, revolutions are taking place in the countryside, in the cities. And who is the man that seems to address the grievances of the Russian masses? It is again Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party. We are now in October of 1917, and Lenin's going to roll the dice. There are people in the party who say, don't do it, Ilyich. That was his nickname, Ilyich. Don't do it. The provisional government still has support. Many people in the Soviet, the other political parties in the Soviet, they will not go along with it. Don't do it. But Lenin was no wimp. Lenin decides it's either now or never. Or at least if we don't make our chance at revolution now, it'll be postponed for years, perhaps decades. And so Lenin rolls the dice. That's what he's going to do. The orders go out to the Red Guard units, his paramilitary organization, to seize power, and they seize power. This is the great October Revolution of 1917. And what's going to happen here again? This is a transformation of absolutely incredible consequences. I think I may have mentioned this to you the last time. When Lenin takes power, first of all, the name of the Bolshevik Party is changed to the Communist Party. Bolshevism and communism are one and the same. Lenin is going to create what he believes is a new world, because first the revolution will come to Russia. He's going to bring that revolution to Russia, and it will be spread to the rest of the world. This is the second and greatest secular messianic revolution in history, or you can say this, the greatest secular messianic movement in history. The first was the French Revolution. When the French said liberté, égalité, and fraternité, it was not only when they proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man in August of 1789. This was not only for the French people, this was for the rest of the world. And in fact, most historians would argue, if you want to track European history down to 1914 from 1789, it is the attempt of Europe to digest the French Revolution. But Lenin is going to go even further and even be more successful. What is the slogan? It's the last sentence of the Communist Manifesto that we all used to read in college and high school during the Cold War. What's the last sentence of the Communist Manifesto? Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. That's the message of Lenin. That's the greatest secular messianic movement in history. Remember, what does a messianic movement do? What does a Messiah do? Both Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all three of them are messianic. The Christians believe the Messiah is coming and will come again. Muslims and Jews believe that the Messiah has yet to come. This is now a secular, a non-religious messianic movement. The world will not be again the same for decades, and in some ways down to the present day. So Lenin has come to power. And again, this is a man that knows how to act and act decisively. With one stroke of the pen, Lenin acquiesces to the agrarian revolution. He declares in the Lenin Decree on Land that all of the land belongs to all of the people. The message goes out, every Russian family is allowed to take as much land as it can farm by itself without hiring labor. In the eyes of Marxist-Leninists, hired labor, no matter what it is paid, is exploited labor. So every Russian family is now told, take as much land as you can, but only as much as your family can farm. The nation owns the land, the people own the land, but you have the right to farm the land. Your family has the right to farm the land in perpetuity. And Lenin does something else. Kerensky finally agreed. He postponed what was called the elections at the Constituent Assembly. This was a demand going back to the 19th century, in which it was hoped that when the Tsar was overthrown, there'll be elections. All classes, all religions, all ethnic groups will be able to participate in elections to a Constituent Assembly, which will decide everything in Russia. Social, economic, political issues in Russia. He resisted that, said you couldn't do it during the war. But finally he agreed. The elections were to be held in November and December of 1917. But he's now overthrown. And he is something not incidental. Keep this in mind for the future. When the Bolsheviks or the communists take power in Russia, and they want to get in Petrograd, they want to really capture Kerensky. Kerensky is smuggled out of Petrograd in a car provided by the American embassy in Petrograd that waves the American flag. The communists will not forget that. So Kerensky is gone, but he's left this legacy. There's going to be elections at the Constituent Assembly. What are we going to do with that? Says Lenin, or says some people in the party. Again, no wimpy, Lenin. He agrees. Well, how will the elections at the Constituent Assembly? We're going to win, he says. Don't worry, the people are with us. The elections are held, and the Bolsheviks do well, but they don't win. They get 25% of the vote. Another party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and all of its factions, gains close to 50% of the vote. What's Lenin going to do? The Constituent Assembly is now a competitive government. What are we going to do? Again, Lenin, a man of great decision. Provisional government meets, establishes laws, meets for 1 day, less than 1 day. Lenin sends a group of Kronstadt sailors. Kronstadt is a great naval base, and revolutionary support is great there. One of the sailors goes over to the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, a man by the name of Chernov, who is the representative of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the leader of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. The sailor puts a bayonet to Chernov's neck and says to Chernov, Comrade Chernov, the meeting is over. And Chernov says, well, what do you mean? We just started meeting. No, Comrade Chernov, says the sailor. The meeting is over. And indeed, the meeting was over. This is when Trotsky used for the first time the expression that the Constituent Assembly has disappeared into the garbage can of history. We'll pick up Lenin next week when we talk about 1918. Then the second development, changing the history of our country. Woodrow Wilson on April 6th of 1917 asked Congress for a declaration of war. How did it come to this? American public opinion, again, was tilting towards the British side. There's no question of that. The reasons for that were, even before December of 1916, German submarines were sinking American ships, sinking British ships, sinking other neutral ships, and Americans, civilians were getting killed. The most famous of that is, of course, the sinking of the Lusitania. So American public opinion is really moving in a rapidly anti-German position. Now, here's something to keep in mind when we discuss the second series on World War II, and when I get into the Holocaust in World War II. A good part of the tilt in American public opinion against the Germans is a consequence of British atrocity propaganda. The British are lying through their teeth. They talk about, now, again, I have to be careful here. I said this to you before. The Germans were not Vestal virgins in World War I. They committed atrocities against civilians. But the Germans of World War I were not the Germans of World War II. But the British make them out to be demons, absolutely horrors. And again, I think I mentioned this to you. One of the things that the British are going to say, which resonates in the 1940s in our country, I think I mentioned this to you before, and that is British propaganda is going to say not only the Germans rape women and girls, not only do they rape nuns, but the Germans, after a battle, go out into the battlefield, pick up dead British soldiers, and turn their bodies into soap. It never happened. It never happened. But again, British atrocity propaganda is very effective. Then there are the American banks who've lent Britain and France probably close to $4 billion when $4 billion really meant something. If Britain and France lose the war, American banks will be in desperate shape. And then, of course, how many times have I said to you, I drum it into my students ad nauseum, never minimize the role of personality in history. If Woodrow Wilson was not there, if he was not the president, who knows what would have happened? Now, running against him, again, on a number of occasions, at least on one occasion, was Teddy Roosevelt. But Teddy Roosevelt was a wanted intervention in the war. He was a war interventionist. But other people, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, were not. Wilson believes. Now, Wilson was a very interesting man. We no longer look upon Woodrow Wilson in the same way that we used to. We don't do it anymore. When I went to high school, and when you went to high school and college, for the most part, Woodrow Wilson was looked upon very kindly. He was, after all, a trust buster. He was what would be called a progressive. He was a good and decent man, at least on the surface. Today we know that Woodrow Wilson was a blatant racist. He hated black people, hated them. He was a true Southerner of his time. It is under Woodrow Wilson, how can I say this? I'll use the language, a word that all of you are familiar with. It's under Woodrow Wilson in Washington, D.C., in civil service offices, that a mechitza is established. There's a curtain that's actually established, separating black workers from white workers. That is, we will never know how many black men and women lost their careers, had their careers thwarted by Woodrow Wilson. But Woodrow Wilson, again, on the international scene, is hailed as a hero. This is the man that proclaims self-determination for all nationalities. This is a man that says this terrible war is going to be a war that ends all wars. Wilson had a vision of an international organization that soon comes to be called the League of Nations. Wilson believed that we can fight this war, beat Germany, establish the League of Nations, and will prevent war from ever occurring again. But Wilson also understood, I will not be, and the United States will not be able to shape the future unless I have a seat at the table. And America cannot have a seat at the table unless it enters the war. So these are some of the concerns. These are some of the reasons that we enter the war. So what's going to happen here is we enter the war. There are other concerns here. Wilson is going to tell the American people it is wrong that the Germans do not allow freedom of the seas. There has to be freedom of the seas. And underneath it all, a number of historians have suggested that there is this idea of the balance of power. For the British, it's an axiom. For the Americans, it's an inclination. Remember, I told you this before? The British axiom is that no one country should ever be able to attain hegemony over the European continent, lest it be in a position to utilize or exploit the human and natural resources of Europe to mount an attack upon Britain itself. Wilson is uncomfortable with a German-dominated Europe. So for a variety of reasons, we are going to enter World War I. And the history of the United States is never again going to be the same. It will take us a while. It will, in fact, take us a while to gear up for the war. Industrially, we never gear up for the war. American soldiers they're fighting in British tanks, British and French tanks. American pilots are flying, for the most part, in British and in French planes. But in terms of manpower, what is our great contribution in World War I? We bring fresh meat to the battlefield. We bring fresh meat to pay the butcher's bill. By early 1918, 300,000 American soldiers are arriving in France each month. Germany is almost exhausted. The submarine warfare has not brought England to its knees. The convoy system is very, very effective. The British have broken a number of German codes. The British are very good at cryptography. The result is going to be here is that the United States, as we see in the next lecture, is going to tilt the war in behalf of the Allies. We are the guarantors of victory. In our own country, this is going to have really very monumental consequences. First of all, we go on to conscription. For the first time since the Civil War, the United States goes on to conscription. Second, remember what Senator Hiram Johnson had said? That is, I said it to you before early in the lecture. In war, the first casualty is the truth. We will not tolerate in war any rumors or anything that seems to be taking away from the war effort. We tighten up. We have an office of censorship. We restrict the press. We arrest people who are against the war. Eugene Victor Debs, for those of you that come from New York City, remember there was a radio station, WEVD. That's W. Eugene Victor Debs. That's a station that began, not as a liberal station, but it began to be the Jewish station in New York City. It no longer functions. And Debs, who ran as a Socialist Party candidate, is actually arrested because he is speaking out against the war. The government now intervenes in a whole variety of areas, not only in censorship, but with the unions, with manufacturing, with the railroads, and a whole host of ways. In some ways, it could be argued that governmental intervention in American society, which begins after our entrance into World War I, never disappears, never disappears. And some of the people who are involved in the Wilsonian administration are people that will play a role in Roosevelt's New Deal. But that's for another lecture series. Here we are talking about American entry into World War I. So, again, we have entered the war. The Bolsheviks have taken power. And I must tell you, two things before we adjourn. It's not a slam dunk for Wilson to bring us into the war. It really isn't. Because there are large numbers of Americans that do not want entry into World War I. Perhaps the largest ethnic group in American society, in this case, and at this period of time, were German Americans. They are queasy about America entering into the war on the Allied side. And another group, large group of Americans, growing increasingly active in politics, Irish Americans, don't want to enter the war on the British side because of all the troubles in Ireland. They don't want it. And remember, even before we enter the war, there's the Easter Uprising in 1916 in Ireland against the British. And finally, it's the Jews. The overwhelming majority of Jews before February of 1916 do not want to enter the war. And if they want to enter the war, they want to enter the war on the German side. Remember, most American Jews, as of 1917, were people who had come from Eastern Europe. And most of those who came from Eastern Europe came from the Russian Empire, fleeing the Tsarist government. Why should we enter the war on the Tsarist government side? This is the land of pogroms. This is the land of anti-Semitism. This is the land of the Bayless affair. Should mighty America, decent, free, democratic America, enter the war on the side of the Romanov dynasty? So Jewish opposition is quite important here, except it begins to change, of course, with the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty. So what happens now is that the Jews begin to support the war in growing numbers. But there are still who are reluctant to get into the war. Now, here I give you parentheses. The impact of the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty and the creation of dual power in Russia is going to cause some family crises for American Jews. The leading Yiddish newspaper of the time, the Vovitz, the Jewish Daily Forward, had a column, Bintler Brief, a bundle of letters, in which people, Jews from the Lower East Side, wrote letters to the editor of the Forward, and he would give them answers. We have those letters. Some of them have been translated into English. One of the letters, but there are more like this letter. A woman writes to the editor of the Forward. She says, I came to America. I have a husband, I have 3 children. But my husband was a revolutionary in Russia. That's why we had to flee. But now that the Tsarist government is overthrown, he wants to go back to Russia. He wants to carry out a socialist revolution in Russia. He wants to bring me and the children back to Russia. I do not want to go. American Jews, in many cases, particularly those on the left, and so many were on the left at that period of time, are conflicted. Some of them want to stay, some want to go back. That is also true in the kibbutzim. that is in the small number of kibbutzim and moshavim in Palestine at this period of time. The Soviet Union will exercise enormous influence on the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine. We'll pick that up somewhat later. But this is even in 1917. There are people from Palestine who go back to Russia, hoping that they can create a socialist revolution. So, again, the American entry into the war is very consequential. And then I end with this. Perhaps for the Jewish people, the most consequential event of them all. In 1917, and the most consequential event of World War I. On November 2nd of 1917, the government of Lloyd George, with Lord Balfour as its foreign minister, issues what comes to be known as the Balfour Declaration. For the first time in history, certainly in 2,000 years, one of the world's greatest powers has supported the idea of a Jewish home in Palestine. The Zionist movement had argued for a Jewish state. A Jewish state. The Balfour Declaration is not going to say a Jewish state. It's going to say a Jewish national home, and that's a problem. The world knows from states. It will soon know from mandates. What the devil does a Jewish national home mean? Because the issue, a state has sovereignty. A state can decide its own future. A state can decide who has the right to come into the state. But this is not a Jewish state. This is a Jewish national home. And the British will soon be given the mandate for creating eventually a Jewish state, but for a long time to come, it's a Jewish national home, which means that the British will control immigration into Palestine. Why isn't there in the Balfour Declaration a call for a Jewish state? Why doesn't it say a Jewish state? You ready for me now? It's because prominent British Jews pressured the British government, pressured Balfour, not to call for a Jewish state. Because what prominent British Jews are worried about, this is the term that is not used at that period of time. It's a term that we use now and have used for some time. British well-to-do Jews are worried about the charge of dual loyalty. If a Jewish state is created, remember, British Jews were only allowed to sit in Parliament. They were allowed to sit in Parliament for decades, but they never sat. And you know why they never sat? Because they had to swear allegiance to the crown on the New Testament. It's only when one of the Rothschilds is elected and says, I will not swear allegiance to the crown on the New Testament, but on the Hebrew scriptures, that changes. So prominent British Jews are worried about the charge of dual loyalty. That's why it says a Jewish national home. What are the motivations? Again, reverse racism here. The British believe that the Jews have enormous power, that they control the Russian revolutionaries, that they control the American government, and so on. They're not the first, not the last to think this. So what the British government is going to do, or it's going to reason, we got to do something for the Jews if we want to keep America in the war and we want to keep Russia in the war. And so we're going to give the Jews a national home. That's one of the reasons for the Balfour Declaration. And the second reason is, you got to be careful now. Altruism is in play here. In his diaries, Balfour says, again, forgive my crudeness, these are not the words he uses. We've screwed the Jews for over 2,000 years. Now we got to set the record straight, do something for them. That's one thing. Is there? Don't minimize, I told you, honor, altruism, and so on as causes for events. In addition to that, there's an adage about England. England has no eternal allies. England has no eternal enemies. England only has eternal interests. If we create a Jewish national home in Palestine, we can station British soldiers there. They're in the vicinity of the Suez Canal. And if the Egyptians try to take over the Suez Canal, we can send troops across the Sinai Desert from Jewish Palestine, and they will crush any Egyptian revolt. These are the reasons for the Balfour Declaration. And last point, before I call it a day. What's wrong with the Balfour Declaration? Well, I told you some of it, but there's something else that's wrong. It's in the first sentence. It's not the whole sentence, it's the first part of the first sentence of the Balfour Declaration. Dear Lord Rothschild, he is the titular head of the Jewish community in Great Britain. It is my pleasure to inform you that His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Again, I tell you, what does a Jewish national home mean? What does it mean? Nobody knows. And what do the words in Palestine mean? Does it mean all of Palestine? The Palestine that was part of the Ottoman Empire? Or does it mean part of Palestine? And if it means only part of Palestine, which part of Palestine does it mean? These are the questions that will, again, echo right down in the interwar period, right down to 1948. So, my friends, 1917 is a year of consequence. Again, American entry into the war, the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty, the communists coming to power, the Balfour Declaration. If you are inclined to take your history through film, let me tell you some films. Either you see the original or the remake. They are both superb. All Quiet on the Western Front. This is a superb film. That's, of course, about the German army. From the British Army, there's the more recent film, 1917. And then an event that I did not talk to you about, there's a mutiny in the French army in 1917. It's the best kept secret on the Allied side, because had the Germans known about it, they could have cracked through. But it is a secret. The mutiny is contained. No, the Germans never learn about it. The man who contains it is General Petain. And the film that some of you may have seen, again, a golden oldie from the 1950s, that's Paths of Glory. Paths of Glory with Kirk Douglas. So, Gila, I'm done. Let her rip.
Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting and fascinating as usual. There's a few questions. Is there anything else significant that happens on the Eastern Front besides the fall of the Tsarist Russia?
On the Eastern Front?
Yeah.
No, well, there is the mutiny that takes place.
Okay.
That's important. Continuing loss of blood on both the Eastern Front and the Western Front. And also in December of 1917, I was going to get into this next week, but since you raised the question, in December of 1916, Lenin signs an armistice with the Germans. Lenin is preparing to pull Russia out of the war. And when that armistice takes place, it will soon be followed by a peace treaty in March of 1918. That's for next week. When this takes place, forgive my crudeness, they're pissing in their boots in Washington and London and Paris, because they believe that if Lenin pulls Russia out of the war, the Germans will shift their forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and really win the war. So these are the most important things of 1917.
That kind of leads into the next question, which is how much did Germany play in the role of Lenin's rise to power?
That's a very interesting question. And indeed, again, let me just go back to something, or again, when I said to you why we entered the war, someone mentioned this last week, there's the Zimmerman note. Foreign Minister Zimmerman had sent a letter to the German ambassador to Mexico, telling the Mexicans that if they intervene in the war, they can give American territory back. That the British break the code, it's published, and inflames American public opinion. Now, German Gold is actually a book written in Russian. German Gold, Key to Bolshevik Victory. The Germans are important in this. They do provide money. Most important of all, Lenin is in Switzerland at the time of the February Revolution. The Germans know a good man when they see it. Lenin was one of the few socialists that opposed the war. Lenin believed that this was a capitalist war. And Lenin's slogan was, turn the imperialist war into a class war. What he was really saying to the workers of all countries, leave the front, leave the trenches, but bring back with you as you go home your rifles and your bayonets and shove them into the fat bellies of the capitalists. Turn the imperialist war into a class war. The Germans are aware of this. They allow Lenin to go back to Russia. That's the famous SEAL train. They allow him to go back to Russia because they believe, correctly, Lenin's going to pull Russia out of the war. Now, one might ask, aren't they afraid of Lenin's statements that may, let's say, infect German soldiers to go back home and to end the war? They are not. They are confident that German soldiers will not desert, will not fall prey to socialist propaganda. They're wrong in that, but it's taken almost another year for that to manifest itself. So the direct answer to the question is German gold is important, and most significant of all is the fact that the Germans are allowed to go back, that Lenin is allowed to go back because the Germans will allow him to go back. But you can't push this too far. Lenin objectively is working for the Germans. He doesn't give a damn about the Germans. He's not a German agent, as anti-communist forces will say. Objectively, he's working for the Germans. He's getting money from them. But he has his own purposes. He doesn't care who wins the war. He wants the war to end. He wants to come to power. Yes,
thank you for that. Quite a few people have asked about the role of Trotsky. And
poor Trotsky, poor Leon Bronstein, right? A Jewish farmer, be it incredible though it may seem. Here, I'll tell you, I may have said this to you before, some of you before. The chief rabbi of Moscow said, correctly, the Trotskys play the tune, the Bronsteins pay the piper. Do you understand what that means? Trotsky's real name is Bronstein. When he is asked in the 1920s, what are you, Comrade Trotsky? He says, I'm a proletarian internationalist, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. Not so. In the eyes of many Russians, all those who oppose communism, he's a Zhid, he's a kike. And in a Russia that many Russians believe in the slogan, Bezhidov spasai Rossiyu, beat the kikes and save Russia. Trotsky is a tremendous bogeyman for people on the right in Russia. Now, Trotsky's role is a very important one. He is the leader of the Red Army that will be created in 1918. He is the man that adamantly proposes to Lenin the idea that we should take power. Because traditional Marxism, orthodox Marxism, had said, no, the country is not prepared for it. We have to have a capitalist revolution first. Trotsky is the author of the idea or the concept of permanent revolution. It's Trotsky's idea, which is accepted by Lenin, that although the workers are not that strong, they are stronger than the bourgeoisie, the middle class. Orthodox Marxism had said that the middle class has to make the revolution, establish capitalism, and then after decades, there will be enough workers, enough industrialization, that the working class can overthrow the capitalist system and introduce socialism. It's Trotsky who says, you'll whistle Dixie, it'll be eternity until the middle class in Russia has the guts and the wherewithal to overthrow the Tsar. We will overthrow the provision. We must overthrow the provisional government. And we must institute socialism. The revolution becomes permanent. Not only do we overthrow the Tsar, we overthrow the provisional government. And he also says the revolution is permanent in another way. It doesn't stop at the borders of Russia. That is, he understood that Russia was not totally prepared for a socialist revolution. But he believed that if we bring socialism to Russia, we bring about a revolution, this will have an inspirational effect upon the working class in the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany. They are well prepared for socialism. They will bring us about a socialist revolution. They will help us, and then we will create socialism in Russia. This is the idea of permanent revolution, and this is the blueprint that Lenin works on and implements in 1917. And Trotsky is a leader of the Russian revolutionary movement, and throughout 1917 mobilizes the workers. This is a great man. This was truly a great man, but not a man of great political acumen. Lenin will produce him, put him in the side to a certain extent, but again, still a great man. It's Stalin outfoxes him again and again in the 1920s. That is for another lecture series, not this one.
Okay. Do you think there's anything else that Kerensky could have done to save the government?
The answer is yes. And I think I mentioned this to you. He could have ended the war. That's what he should have done. He should have ended the war. But I want to be fair. Kerensky does not know what Lenin knows. Kerensky does not know that the Allies are going to win the war. You couldn't predict in 1917 that Germany would lose the war. But in 1918, we'll come back to this next week. In 1918, Lenin can predict that the Allies will win the war. And therefore, he can make peace with Germany. He doesn't have to worry about the Germans shifting forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and then defeating the Allies, coming back and destroy Russia. History is fluid. It's not stagnant. 1918 is different because the Americans are coming. 1917, we've declared war, but there are very few American soldiers in France at this period of time.
Okay. And what is the motive to kill the Romanovs?
You know, that's for 1918, Gila.
Okay. All right. So we'll wait for that. Okay. Hold on. We've got more questions. And how much control do you think Lenin really had over the revolution? Was he a mastermind or was he an opportunist?
He is both a mastermind and an opportunist. That's not a waffle. This is what charisma is all about. Lenin controls the Bolshevik Party. No one can oppose. They can oppose him, but they can never win in the Central Committee. No other political party in Russia has leadership like that. There are people in the Menshevik Party, left-wing Socialist Revolutionary Party, who want to pull Russia out of the war. But they can't control their party or parties as Lenin controlled his party. That's what charisma is all about, again and again. And we'll see this next week when it comes to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. When the communist government moves from an armistice to a peace treaty, a very humiliating peace treaty, where Russia is forced to make tremendous territorial concessions. And the people in the party say, the Russian people will never forgive us for this. Lenin says, we got to do it. We can't win the Civil War and win the war against the Germans. But the Germans are going to lose the war and we can get back a lot of what we've lost.
Okay. And I guess the same question from Kerensky to America. Is there anything else Woodrow Wilson could have done to keep America out of the war?
Yeah. He could have said, remember, in 1916, Wilson ran for re-election. And the slogan of the Democratic Party was, he kept us out of war. He could have kept us out of war. But remember, you got to go back to place and time. This is a man, he's an internationalist. He believes we can end war, this terrible scourge of humanity, thousands of years of warfare. He can end it all. If we get in, we get a seat at the table, create the League of Nations, we'll end war for all time. So it's like asking, it's a bad analogy, so I won't even use it. It's like, as some people are anti-Semites, what would have happened if they weren't anti-Semites? But they were. And he believes in freedom of the seas. He believes that there should be, again, a war to end all wars. He needs a seat at the table. He's going to get involved.
Okay. Thank you so much for these enlightening additions to our knowledge and broadening our perspectives on all of the different players and the stakes that have all led to the Great War. And we look forward to the last session, which will be next week, session number 4, and we'll complete this series. Thank you so much. And then, of course, I don't know if you know, but then in March, we'll be moving on to World War II with Professor Berk. So this is really setting the stage for all of that. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Berk.
You, Gila, I love that Australian accent. Shalom uvracha.